Lowering your voltage will allow you to move slower when you tattoo, which gives you more time to make decisions, which is especially critical when you're doing portraits. I typically like to run my machine no higher than 6.5 volts, and most of the time I'm only on 6. Another pointer is to make sure your mag is constantly moving. Whenever you see inconsistencies in shading, it's because they stopped their motion. If you're constantly moving, then there'll never be an area that's overly shaded more than you wanted it to. And this is why it's very important to constantly practice the movements and directions so that'll be easier for you to do. In my last video, I talked about shading. And today's video will be about how to improve line work. The easiest lines to pull are the ones when you pull towards your body. Start from the top and go to the bottom. Pushing away, I don't recommend, and horizontal pulls can also work as well. Next thing I want to talk about is the wrist. So you're going to want to limit the use of your wrist. Yes, you can use it, but relying on it too much can cause very shaky lines. Let me know if you guys found these tips useful, and also comment below what lining tips you would suggest to help others improve. So there's really no better way for me to give you guys an example on tattoo shading than a Greek mythology piece. So let's get right into it. I have a couple of tips that will be popping up on the screen, and with those tips popping up, I'm going to expand on them in further detail. Tip 1, starting in the lighter areas helps make it easier to get acquainted with your client's skin. And I stress this because when you're first tattooing someone, you don't know how their skin's going to respond to tattooing. You don't know if they swell a lot or they get super red, or if they have tougher skin. You're not sure. So it's easier to start off with the lighter tones. That way you can use that to your advantage to get acquainted. And if things are too light, worst case scenario, you can just darken them rather than them being too dark. Next tip, to maintain a stencil, let it dry 15 to 20 minutes. Wipe using ointment instead of green soap. So this is very helpful for me, even though the clients don't really like it the most, but it's very helpful for you to give them a better tattoo. So what I do is once I put the stencil on, I let it dry for at least 15 to 20 minutes, sometimes even 30 depending on the stencil, and then I'll clean off the excessive ink with ointment rather than green soap. Another tip, the larger the mag, the easier it is to get smooth shading. So basically, when you have a smaller mag, like a 7 mag, it's easier to puncture the skin because it's a smaller surface area that you're puncturing. So when you want smoother shading, then it's easier to get a big mag because it's wider surface area that you're going across. So it's easier to softly tap the top layers of the skin and slowly fan in those tones. So I would say a 25 mag or 14 mag is ideal. Use your liner to pack small areas with black. So with tight corners or small areas, what you can do is take your 3-round liner, 5-round liner, or maybe even a 7, and just go in small circles and fill in the areas, you know. This is really effective, especially if you're inexperienced with a mag, but also it seems to be less trauma on the skin depending on your voltage. But I like this because it just allows more control, and it's just easier to take care of those tight areas that need a lot of black. Okay, up your voltage when working in larger areas. So I would only recommend this to those with a lot of experience with shading, but for larger pieces, I tend to up my voltage by an additional 0.5 or 0.6, depending on the size of the tattoo. And this is because I'm covering larger surface areas, so it requires more hand motion. So faster hand motion, higher voltage. For better white highlights, slow voltage and take your time. Now this tip is self-explanatory, but basically yes, you want to slow down your voltage so you have more time in a certain area, so that way you can really focus on how deep your needle is in the skin, because your needle depth is going to determine the longevity of those whites, and you don't want to over traumatize the skin while you're focusing on that. There's a couple of things I haven't really seen discussed regarding tattoo shading, so I'm going to go over that right now. First thing I want to show you is some mag control here. See, I'm going back and forth in this direction shading this spot, but I'm rotating the mag here by a 30-degree angle just so it can fit between these two lines in my stencil, because if I had it the regular way, it would go outside those lines. When you're doing this technique, the lines that your mag make can be closer together depending on the angle, so you can use that to your advantage. Next thing I want to show you is this. See how when I'm dry wiping, I'm dabbing the skin, not dragging. If you drag on the skin, your client's really not going to like you or when you do that, and neither is their skin. Now what I want to show you is using the corner of your mag for even tighter spaces. See here, I tilt this mag on its corner and it's basically turning this 15 mag into a 7 mag, sometimes a 3 depending on your tilt. Right here in this corner, it's allowing me to work even smaller corners. Be careful with this because depending on the curve of your mag, it will cause excess trauma to the skin depending on how far out your needle is. Let's get right into the video. So we just got some basics here. Our machine, black and gray tones, our color, I'm going to be messing with blue, and our practice skin. Now the biggest issue people have with color packing is their saturation. That's literally what color packing is. You're just saturating the skin. Now I won't go too into depth about saturation and what that is. I have a video on that explains that, and I'll put a card up to that video somewhere up here on the screen. Now we're going to be running on 6 volts here, okay? And let's get our needle out to the appropriate range. Now usually with black and gray shading, I like to float the needle a bit. Now by float the needle, I mean how far the needle is sticking out of the cartridge. With color packing, you're going to want to put your needle a little further in. You don't want to do any needle floating here because we're going to be trying to saturate as much as possible, and this will help you control your ink flow while you're packing that ink into the skin. And we're just going to give the skin a little pass. So as far as hand motion, you can use small circles or pendulum shading. Either one works. And on average, I'll be in one small area about 6 to 8 seconds when I'm saturating color. So now a couple of things that will also make color packing easier is that you don't necessarily need a high voltage. You're probably going to want a machine with a longer stroke because that will give you an easier time punching in the color. And you're also going to want to prioritize using smaller mags. 7 mags or 9 mags are ideal for saturating the skin because they require less pressure to properly puncture the skin in the proper depth. So be mindful of your motion, otherwise you'll end up like this. No. If you're packing like that, please stop. Remember, it's best to go in a consistent back and forth or circular motion when you're packing your color. That's probably the most important thing to remember, otherwise you're going to find your tattoo falling apart. Issue number 2 is going to be gradation. I see a lot of the trouble that I had when I first started was transitioning from one color to another, whether it be a different color or a lighter version of the same color. So this is the method I use to transition over to a different color. Now see, from that start point, I went over it way more. So I gave myself a little fading transition, right? Now we're gonna clear out our cartridge and get back into the mid blue. And I'm gonna dip it in a little white just to get it a little lighter. So that way that transition from that blue we just put in to this blue that we're working right now is a little bit more significant. I'm not going to do the same thing I did before with a deeper level of saturation from the bottom point than the top, and lighter saturation as I work my way up. So that way I'm giving myself an easy taper to work into, you see? So I don't know if you guys can see that. That's that transition we have there, right? Then we're gonna go ahead and dip this in the white ink some more. Sometimes what you can do is empty out our cartridge a little bit so there's not as much blue. That way you can get a more dominant white in there and it'll lighten up your blue quite a bit. See, so we got a kind of a sky blue going there. So we're gonna go ahead and go over this. Pendulum shading I find works really good for transitioning. Or you can do the circleism and just slowly transition up. There we go. And you can do this with pretty much any color. You can mix in blacks or a deep gray. Now, be careful with your grays because when you mix grays, you're gonna end up desaturating your blue or whatever color you're using. You're gonna end up making it muted, a very muted color. So you gotta be careful with that. But with your whites and blacks,
you can mix with those. So in another video I can talk about color theory, which is a whole other subject, which will help assist you guys in transitioning your colors. But this is basically the basics. So you see that tapering out smoothly, you see that?
Let me explain this. Light source is everything when creating contrast, and you want to focus on this heavily, especially if your client has melanin rich or darker skin. I'll be covering that in this video, so let's go. Avoid straightforward light sources as they can make an image look flat. Now typically the human eye is used to seeing things with light above it, just like how there are lights in your house above you, and throughout the day, for the most part, the sun is above us, creating that contrast with the light, and that makes things the most legible in my personal opinion. Now, it can work in certain instances when you're doing portraits of loved ones, where the light source is like flash from a camera is coming to them directly, but for the most part, I will try to avoid this, especially in larger projects that I'm trying to create more legibility. Avoid too many light sources. 2 are ideal, 3 should be maximum. This is self-explanatory. I typically create 1 light source with a tattoo, sometimes 2. I'll have 1 coming from the top and then 1 coming from the side, just hitting the edges of everything to really make things pop and increase legibility. Once you start creating too many light sources with light coming from multiple directions, things start to lose legibility and start to lose contrast. 3. There should be an even balance of blacks, midtones, and open skin. Now, if you have a tattoo with too much black and not enough open skin, it's going to look very dark and blotchy from far away. And if you do the opposite, where there's barely any black and too much open skin, then there's not going to be enough contrast to create that legibility, and then eventually you start to lose the design and it becomes flat. What you're going to want to do is create an even balance of blacks and the midtones as well as open skin to create that contrast. Use proper dilution mix according to client skin tone. Now, if you're one of those who make your own washes every time you tattoo, this is very important. If your client is a deeper melanin skin tone, you're gonna wanna use a deeper tones versus what you would use on a lighter client. Otherwise, when you tattoo them, once it heals, you're gonna end up with a much lighter tattoo than it looked when it was initially done. For example, for this client, I used 100% black and then 75% black with 25% water, and then for the lightest tones, 50% black and 50% water. This is my wash system. I'll start off with 100% black, and then from there I'll move over to 75% black with the other 25% being water. Then we're gonna go over to 50% with the other 50% being water. Then about 20% black and the other 80% being water. And then on rare occasions, I rarely use this, but I always have it up there as like a couple of drops in mostly water. Now, my favorite ink to use for this is Dynamic Black since it's so thin, but I've been using the Eternal Lining Black, which has been working pretty good for me too. Now, depending on how you saturate is going to determine the effect you get from each wash. For example, here I'm using 75%, and I'm going to show you guys exactly how your saturation level can determine the tone you achieve when you're tattooing. So I'm going to start off here with the lightest tone, and I'm just doing my usual technique. Now as you're washing, you're just seeing me kind of pile on the ink layer by layer, and this will be our lightest tone here. For your guys' reference, I'm on 6.5 volts, and we just finished our lightest tone, so we're moving on over to our second tone over, and you can see I just did a few passes over it. You can see it's pretty light, and this is on 75%. The effect would be a little different on actual skin, but this is just an example to show you guys exactly what I mean by saturation. Now, on this go around, I'm passing this a little bit more times than I did the first one, so I can darken it up, and you guys will see that right here, as the tone is just about halfway darker than the one prior. Now we're gonna do the darkest one here, and this one's gonna take the most time, obviously, because we're going to have to do more passes with this one to get that darker tone. So you'll see me doing that right now. Also, how much pressure you apply will also determine how long it will take to saturate the area. So here I'm just going to be applying a bit more pressure towards the end, to really make sure we're packing that ink in as much as possible. The sound you hear will also let you know how deep you're going. When you start pressing harder, you'll hear the difference in the tone of the buzzing from the machine. And if you listen carefully, you'll hear that change right now. The buzzing's a lot more aggressive sounding when you're pressing harder. And that'll let you know the depth you're applying with the needle on top of seeing what you're doing. So again, this was all the 75% wash, and this is showing just what happens when you use different pressures and different amounts of passes. You can achieve different tones with the same ink as long as you use control of your mag in such manner. Now I want to show you guys more about my technique that I was saying earlier. My raking pattern, you can see here when I say that cross hatching, it starts with the pattern that's created with your mag when you slowly drag it against the skin. Now, this is a lot slower than how I was doing it before, but I'm just slowing down so you can really see exactly what I'm doing when I'm shading. So we went our first direction here, and as you can see after I wipe it, the patterns are a little bit darker than usual. I'm going a little harder than what I typically would on the skin, but I just want you guys to really be able to see this pattern here. And so you can see I'm going in the other direction, creating the crosshatch pattern that I often talk about. Now, to achieve a smoother effect, you're going to want to continue going in different directions. So now I'm going back over it in the direction I was before, only slightly different to smoothen out that pattern. The more times you go over it, the less you'll be able to see the pattern, and hence that's how you achieve the smooth shading with this technique that I use. Now we're going to do another direction here, and how many directions you want to go is completely up to you guys. It just really varies depending on how smooth you want it to look, your saturation level and the tone you're using, as well as the voltage. So play around with this on practice skin and adjust this technique to your level of comfort. Now, I'm sure you all have other questions, so this will be a series. I'm going to be expanding on these techniques and going into further depth regarding the different variations about what you can do with this. So I'm going to show you guys all the different ways I use the liner to my advantage when tattooing. So I'm going to start off with shading. Shading is a similar technique I use when I use a mag. I talk about it in my other video with the pendulum shading technique. Basically is where you see the needle is swinging back and forth. That's the motion I'm using when I'm just trying to shade in a general area without creating any hard edges. Now I'm going to show you guys some more of the pendulum shading technique, but just from a different angle here. And as you can see, I'm going back and forth in the same direction. But what this will do is, now that I'm cross hatching, because in the shading before I was going in the opposite direction, and now I'm shading this way. And so what you're going to see is over time you're going to create a consistent smooth shading pattern with the 3-round liner. Now what I'm going to show you is an important thing about hand speed when you're doing this technique. Now I'm applying the same technique here, but as you can see, there's a lot less control because I'm trying to move faster, and so naturally it's going to be harder to control the needle when you're moving this fast. Obviously experienced artists over time will probably gain the skill to be able to do that fast, but if you're starting out, it's probably good to move slower and get the hang of that shading style. Next I'm going to show you is what is referred to as stipple shading, and this is basically the same thing. Only difference really here is that I'm starting at a point and swinging my needle forward on from that point, and eventually what you're going to do is you're going to build up. The tones at the starting point are going to be much darker, and then the edge is continuously lighter as you flick away from the spot that you originally start putting your needle in. Next I want to show y'all a few ways that I help keep my lines cleaner and maintain steadiness while doing lines. So here I'm going in this circular motion here as kind of a warm-up, because I'm going to do a line. I'm going to pull a line as a circle, and that's just to warm up the muscle memory. When I get that muscle memory going before you pull the line, just warm up your arm and get it to remember the motion you need to do to pull the line comfortably. So right here I'm just showing you guys me pulling the line, going in that consistent circle. Now obviously on real skin you're not going to go over it this many times, but I'm just showing you here how this practice can help you maintain the the consistency that you need to make clean lines. Another thing I want to point out that often isn't talked about is holding your breath. Taking a deep breath before you pull a line is very helpful to remove shakiness while pulling lines. So this has been one of the most beneficial things that was often overlooked, I feel like. Now I'm going to show you another stabilization trick. I take my pinky out, as I mentioned in another video, and I'm going to use that as like a kickstand, and then I'm going to press my ring finger against my thumb and use that to stabilize each other and drag slowly while I'm pulling my lines. And this will be very helpful when you're working in small areas and you just need that extra bit of sturdiness. Now, another way I use my mag is to pack small areas with black. The technique is fairly simple. What you're going to be doing is packing the area the same way you would do color packing or packing an area of the skin with black, like you do with the mag, but you're just doing it with the round liner, so it's giving you that tighter configuration, which is allowing you to work in smaller areas and not go outside the lines or the parameters that you're aiming to do. Things to be sure of is that you're going in a continuous motion and not staying in the same spot for long periods of time, and also your needle depth, of course, because this is still a liner and it requires a lot less pressure to puncture the skin deeper than a mag would, or a larger mag per se. So cleaning up edges with your liner, if you do realism, then this one is going to be really helpful for you. So I take my liner and I just kind of do the pendulum shading technique, or just kind of swipe at the edge, and the liner can get a certain level of sharpness that it's much more difficult to get with your mag. So that's what I like to use my mag for, is just to clean up those edges. And if I really want to define something, this is what you can use your liner for. You don't want to pull the line and make a solid line. What you want to kind of do is fan it in and slowly work towards sharpening up the edge to your preference. Now what I'm going to show you is the difference in your voltage and how it affects what your tattoo looks like. Now, hand motion one thing, but voltage is another, and mixing between the differences in voltage and hand motion will affect the difference in what your tattoo looks like. So I'm going to show you guys an example. Right now we're starting off on 5.5 volts, and I'm just going to use the stipple and shading method, just flicking outwards from a singular point. Now, as you guys can see here, the stippling effect is relatively light, and with the dots being pretty decent space from each other, we're going to go over to 6.5 volts now to see the difference. So repeating the process, we're going to do the stipple shading, flicking outwards, and now I'm going to show you guys exactly how much different it looks with that different voltage. Not a big difference, but you can kind of see it here. Now we're going to go over to 7.5 volts, so up one more volt, and we're going to repeat that process again for the third time. And you guys will see the difference here after only a couple of flicks and about the same amount of time. The difference, see, this one's a bit darker. We can go over it a couple of more flicks just so we can see that difference more. You can see the dots are a lot closer together, and this will be a lot easier to pack an area with this type of voltage. Now we're going to go up to 8.5. I don't usually work on this voltage, but I know there are people who like higher voltages. So just to show you guys an example, I'm also speeding up my hand motion a bit. This one's pretty fast. You can see the dots here very close together. That starting point is very dark, a lot darker than the other areas. For me personally, I felt like it almost made me work faster with this type of voltage. So I had them all marked here, the 5.5, the 6.5, the 7.5, and the 8.5. So you can see all the differences here. You can't always ground your wrist on everything, so a lot of the times I'll use my pinky for support. See right there? I'll stick this finger out like a kickstand to rest against the nearest surface, so that way I can steady my hand while I'm tattooing small areas like that. 3 mistakes I see people making when they're doing their shading, and we're gonna go over this right now. Now before we do, go ahead and leave a like on this video for me, and also subscribe if you found this video helpful. So right off, number 1 is going to be voltage. Many artists starting off trying to get the hang of shading oftentimes will have their voltage a bit too high, maybe even too low, but more often too high, I see. If you're not sure what exactly voltage to be on, it's probably better that you're on a lower one. So go ahead and start on a decent one like 6, I would recommend, maybe even 6.5 depending on your machine. Now this is going to lead us right into number 2, which correlates with number 1 in a way. Your hand speed is very important in correlation with the machine speed of your machine. So that's why I recommend starting off on slower machine voltage. That way you can lower your hand speed and focus on controlling the mag. Which is going to lead us right into number 3, needle depth. Now, this one is in particularly important because when you slow down, this allows you to control the depth, which will allow you to get softer shading. Controlling your depth when shading is a very underrated technique that allow you to even control the tones that you get when your client's tattoo heals. Now, there's more than one way to tattoo, and this is really just a guideline for those who are just now starting and to make that process easier for them. My client wanted a tattoo of an album cover, and ironically I had a design that I made some time back, a bit similar to it, so I took basically most of that design and converted it over into what he wanted. And in the original design, we ended up deciding later on to put the stuff that was there in that original design. So you'll see here, after I pull the stencil off, where I draw it on with a marker. From here, I basically just use a 3-round liner and use stipple shading to create a rougher texture for that bone, because I really wanted it to complement the softness of the flowers and wanted a sort of contrast there. With the hibiscus flower, I did burgundy and a mix of pink and then some whites to make it brighter, as well as some grays for the darker points. And then it was pretty much all pink for that other flower there. I forget the name of it. Then I did the same as well for these blue flowers to the side of the rib cage. It was more like a deeper blue, and then I mixed it with white and gradually got lighter as I went up. Then for the skull, I wanted it to stand out, obviously, so I shaded the background, and when I did that, I allowed me to see how dark I wanted to make the background, because I didn't want it to be too close to the tones of the darker shadows in the skull to create that contrast there. And if you guys are enjoying these time lapses, I have a shameless plug for y'all. I got more time lapses up on my YouTube video, so y'all check that out just in case you want to see that. But back to this skull, I went and shaded the background in slowly, made it just a little bit darker just to play around with the tones, make sure I had some darkness in the skull, but still some contrast between the background and the skull itself. And voila, here's the result, man. Like, let me know what y'all think. I love how this one came out. So my client wanted her mother's rosary on her foot, so we took a few pictures just for additional reference. I broke up the stencil in a few pieces just so it'd be easier to get around the ankle. That I can say was the hardest part of doing this. And it took a couple of tries, and I actually ended up using a Sharpie marker to make adjustments. So I started off with the 3-round liner, just doing all the blacks. Then I went ahead and did the whites, since I didn't want her foot to be so sore if I did the whole thing and then went in with white after everything was finished. After doing the dark parts, I went in sections and go ahead and filled in those green areas with the 3-round liner, and did the same accordingly, adding the whites for the highlights. I also used the 15 mag for the little drop shadow I have under there for an additional realistic effect, just to make it seem like it was really on her ankle. Now, luckily, she had a very high pain tolerance and handled this area very well, as I would consider this one of the more sensitive areas to tattoo. Also, can be more difficult because of the thinness of the skin, especially over there as you get closer to the Achilles. But here's the result, guys. Let me know what you think. I loved how this one came out. She was really happy with the result. Your setup is your safe haven for your creative space. Make sure that you're setting it up in a way that you're very comfortable, as this is often overlooked. Tattooing is already a difficult enough job, so there's a few things that you're gonna want to make sure you have, so that way you make yourself perform better, because if you're not comfortable, it's going to make tattooing much harder and is going to affect your work. So 1, make sure you're giving yourself enough space to move your chair around and roll and adjust comfortably while you're taking different angles for your tattoo. 2, make sure you are putting your reference at a good height to where it's eye level and you don't have to put too much stress over your neck over time from constantly having to look at it. 3, make sure your station is in a close, easy reaching proximity to where you're not putting too much strain on your shoulder and arm when reaching out and dipping into different inks. And 4, be sure to have your light in the proper area so you're not constantly dodging glare. And be sure to check out the other videos below for more tips. Thanks for watching the video. If you guys want to learn more, I have my tattoo shading course. Link will be down in the description.